Hey folks, welcome to week 3. So this week we're just going to dive a bit into how the dashboard is working, how we're going to add some tracks to our playlist, and take a little look at the model view controller pattern. So we'll jump straight into that now. First one we go to is our dashboard, just for a bit of a deeper dive into how everything is working together. So last week in the lab, we created our dashboard, which will render. Let me get my arrow back here, which will render some playlists for us, and we have the ability to add a playlist as well. So we jumped in and we added a form, which we haven't really explained forms yet, which we will either, I think it's next week, maybe the week after. And we're submitting that form, doing a HTTP post, and creating some playlists within our playlist store. So if we take a look at the code over here, we can see we have our dashboard controller, and we'll step through each of the individual pieces of this now. So in our dashboard controller, we use our import syntax to import what we call a module, and that module is called playlist store. It's in a models directory, so very similar words there, but they are different. And model typically relates to our data model. Within our dashboard controller, which is a module itself, we export this object of the dashboard controller, and it has two methods, index and add playlist. And in the context of controllers, methods are sometimes called actions. So you might see that word used interchangeably with methods when we're talking about controllers. And typically you would not use the word action when you're talking about a class and its controllers. Sorry, when you're talking about a class and its methods. So you may potentially have, sorry, my pen is gone again. Give me 1 second. Apologies, technical difficulties. So as I was mentioning, we have our controller with our actions, and typically we end up calling what are route to actions. You can call them methods as well. People typically call them functions as well. But the key thing is that in a regular class, you wouldn't really, or even an object, you wouldn't really be calling the methods actions unless they're in the context of a controller that's routing to them. So just something to kind of keep in mind there. So again, just to recap, we have our import of our model, which is our playlist store. And then we have an object, which is our dashboard controller, which we're exporting from our module. And it has two actions, index and add playlist. And so when the / dashboard route is triggered, we end up in the index. And that's really, a pattern that's taken from HTML, where you go to a directory in your HTML, and the first place you will go is index unless an additional path is provided. So that will trigger our action, where we create an object to pass to our view, where we just have a title, and we're also communicating with our playlist store to retrieve all the playlists from the store. And typically at this point, you won't know too much about what await is, but essentially you're calling something that's happening asynchronously, which basically means the node process is going off. I'm going to do something essentially off the main event loop, and we'll talk about more about that in kind of future weeks, what that actually means. But for now, if you have any bugs where you're like, my playlists aren't coming back, I'm getting a weird promise error or something, it's probably because you forgot the await here. And you'll find in this module, we're kind of skipping over quite a few things that will later come back to either in this module or in the full stack modules in the future of the course. the focus here is just to get working, operational, and getting to a point where we can play around with applications that actually work and do something, and then dig deeper then as we move along. So then we have a log, which will help us out. We have a console.log. Typically, you wouldn't use console.log in a production application, and you would use a logger, but for now we're good here. And then we're rendering a specific view and passing in the view data. When we want to call the action add playlist, we hit the dashboard add playlist route, and it triggers this action. And here, we're essentially just creating a new playlist, and all it really has is a title at the moment. So this is an object with a title that's being pulled from the body of the request. An additional log to help with debugging. And again, we are using the await keyword here because this is an asynchronous action to add the playlist to our playlist store. We then redirect back to our dashboard route to go to the index, and that will show us our playlists listed. So again, after breaking it down, here's the entirety of the code. You can see similarities between both, and that's kind of a pattern we'll be using and learning as we go through the rest of this module. So moving to the next section, we'll talk about how to actually add to our playlists. So where we want to move to now, and where we'll move to in the lab this week, is moving from clicking into our playlists into our playlist itself, and we can add some songs and add some information about those songs as well. So initially, looking at our dashboard controller, where we have our index, and we end up rendering our dashboard view, which is rendered over here on the right hand side, where we have our list of playlists and our add playlist form. Within the playlist themselves, we have an each, where we're iterating over each playlist, doing some Bulma, which we don't really have to think about too much here. Let's just kind of use what's there for us. And we create a link to our playlist with the ID as a parameter in the path. So everything after the .com or the .ie in our URL that isn't a query string, we will refer to it as a path. So we're going to the playlist /ID, and that's our path. And the ID from the playlist is auto-generated within our playlist store model. And so we can use that here to create a link to the playlist itself. We should note down here that our dashboard view is very succinct because we have our list playlist partial and our add playlist partial as well. So then when we click on each of these, we move to a view which will show all the information about our playlist. And we'll dig deeper into how we got here because you can see up here there's a URL that we're going to, and it looks a bit crazy, but we'll move into it now. So to get here, typically we'll need a root, a controller, a view, and a model. So if you wanted to introduce something new into this application, those are typically the things you will need to add. And that's kind of how your head needs to think about these things. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add, a new root, and we're going to add a root to get our playlist with our ID, and this is our path here. So our path is /playlist, and our path is parameterized here. You can see we have a colon here and an ID, and that's the syntax within Express, which we haven't discussed in much detail yet, and we will later on, to put a parameter into our path, because this is going to be an ID, and that ID is going to change every time. So we won't know the ID ahead of time, which is why you would use a parameter. We do know the route, the start of the route for playlist, that's where we want to go. And then the ID obviously will be unique to each playlist we're trying to access. So if we have our playlist controller, we're going to import a playlist store, which will also, which already exists. And we will get our playlist by ID, and we pass in a request.parameters.id. You can see that matches up with what's here. We will get some data for our view and pass it to our playlist view. And if we take a look at our playlist view, right now we just have a title, the playlist title within a section, and our menu kind of partial sitting on top. So we will introduce the ability to this view to save and view all of the tracks or songs in our playlist. Thus, we will be implementing a new model called Playlist Store, called Track Store, excuse me, where we're going to use our JSON-backed database to add, remove, list, different tracks, different songs from our playlist. So again, we don't need to know how this works too much at the moment, but it allows us to have some persistence, which basically means the ability to store data that will persist or last maybe beyond our service restarting. So it's persisted on a file in this case. In a database, it persisted in a database engine, so that when we come back to our service, even if it has restarted, our tracks, our songs, our playlists will still be there. So in the lab, we're going to add a track store, and we're going to essentially just copy and paste that in. But for now, we'll just assume that it works. And you may be wondering where the IDs come from. So there's similar code in our playlist store. So here we're creating a universally unique ID. And this is version 4 of what a universally unique ID is. And really, that's just an ID with enough entropy that the likelihood of the ID, the same ID being generated is, very, 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 very slim. So we use universally unique IDs to give an ID to our tracks and our playlist. And we don't need to understand that too much now. But just for some background context, that is where that is happening at the moment. And it should be known that this UUID here is a module we pulled from the Node package manager, which I will explain next week. So we can, I guess, decompose our view into a couple of partials that we may want to reuse. So, we'll have our listing of tracks and also our adding of tracks, which is very similar to our listing of playlists and our adding of playlists. So now that we are showing our playlist title, we will now, add our list tracks partial and our add tracks partial as well. So again, you can see our view is very succinct, and you can kind of look at this almost without even understanding what's happening and kind of glean what it all means. So when we're listing our tracks, we'll come into our playlist controller, into our index, and we'll get a playlist by ID. And this will pull back all of the tracks for the playlist. And then we will have a table in our view where we have our table, the head of our table rows, our table row for our heading, where we just say track, artist, and duration. And then, we use mustache to put a function in here where we're going to iterate over, this table row, and we're going to add in the data title, artist, and duration for each of the tracks of our playlist. So that's quite, if you're new to this stuff, that's quite dense. There's quite a lot there. So take your time with it. And a lot of what's happening here, will be repeated from the playlist view, the track view. So you'll get to practice it a few times. So when we want to add tracks, we're going to add a new route, and we're going to use the post verb, and we're going to tell it to talk to the playlist controller add track action. And our add track partial, you'll see, is a form, which we will discuss forms in more detail, but it's a way for us to collect user information. And you'd be familiar with forms just from using the internet, I guess, where you fill out a form, your name, address, all that kind of stuff. We're going to post to the action playlist ID add track. So you can see here it's parameterized, and we are going to use the method of post, which is the standard for creating a new item using HTTP. And you can see here we have an input for our title, an input for our artist, and an input for our duration. And then we have our add track button, which will submit this form. So when we look at our action, you can see that we are, first of all, getting our playlist. We are creating a new track object, title, artist, duration. And one thing to note here is that we're not really having any validation here either. And that's something we won't really cover that here, but just to keep that in mind. You might be trying to add a track with a duration of a non-number and it'll fail, and you won't really get a useful error potentially. And that's because we're doing no real validation to make sure what we're posting is what it should be. That's something to worry about later on. So we have a track, and we're going to call our track store add track with our playlist ID and our new track. And then we're going to redirect back to our playlist so we can see the playlist with our new track added, hopefully. Okay, so you will step through that in the lab. The next thing we're going to look at is just looking at how we're implementing and walking through model view controller with our playlist application. So we would have briefly mentioned model view controller in WebDev 1. Now we'll step through it in a bit more of an obvious way with the way the routes, the controllers, the model's kind of pattern is set up within Express, which is running in Node.js. And we'll talk about those latter words kind of next week in a bit more detail. So when we're looking at our application, we have a router, we have a controller, and we have a view. And, clicking on something like the About button goes through a router, goes through our controller, which then will render a view for us. Typically, in this case, we were not accessing the model, but when we move into more complicated views, we need to access a model to get some data. So here is, the simple steps, stepping through the router into the controller, and then the controller knows what view we want to render and will pass any data into that view. And that view then gets generated by our templating engine and pushed back down in the response to the HTTP request you gave us. So we can see here, initially starting out, the About button has a href to the /about path, and a request is sent to the server, and our Express server, which is sitting inside of Node, which is running a HTTP server, will take that request and bring it to the router, and the router will see, oh, you have a path for About. I know, and I have been configured by the developer to go to the about controller.index. So I will take you to the about controller.index, and we have some kind of simple data setting up, which makes our about reusable in a way. And then we will render that view and pass in the view data. So we will then pass the view data to the response.render, and it'll render the about view. This probably should be about view here. And then in our about view, we render our menu, and our active button is about. And that's what our nav partial looks like down here. And essentially, it'll just move us into and the templating engine, will generate the HTML from all the kind of partial definitions that we've created and pass that back down into the response, so that the browser gets the entire view rendered. But we have on the right hand side here, we're using our layout of our main.handlebars, and they all get munged together, pushed down the pipe, down the response. And that's kind of a multi-step process that can be tricky to get your head around because there's a lot happening there. But the main thing is our templating engine, which in this case is Mustache, kind of handles all that for us. So we have our about view, which has partials in it, let's say from menu, and that's all rendered into the body of the main.handlebars and pushed down in our response to the request that's sent up to render the about page. So we'll add in the step of communicating with the model when we click on our kind of more information about our playlist. So we'll now step through the router, the controller. The controller will interact with the model, and then the controller will control which view to render with that data. So a similar diagram to what we had before. However, the controller is going to communicate with the model to get and maybe process some data to be passed to our view. And we're going to pull that from the model, which in this case is our playlist store. So stepping through that, we in our playlist item, we have a link to our playlist and its ID, and the ID is generated when we create the playlist. We don't put that in ourselves, and that happens using the UUID module within playlist store itself. So that request will go to the router. That router will be configured by you to go to the index of the playlist controller. And as you can see here, we're going to communicate with the playlist store to get the playlist using the ID from this parameterized path up here, which we've mentioned already. pull the data out of our quote unquote database and pass that. We basically process it here with view data, very little processing happening here, and pass it into our playlist view. So remember, in our playlist store, we will have get playlist by ID, and that will look like, essentially a tracks with all of its songs. And you can see, each of them will have a title, artist, duration, a playlist ID, and then its own ID. So then when we render our playlist view, we have additional partials here than what we saw before. So we have our view data, which will be handled by Mustache in, I keep saying mustache when I should be saying handlebars, by the way, because one is the offshoot of the other. So I'll revert to calling it handlebars now, which it should be. So we're going to create our table, and for each of the tracks, iterate over each track, put the data in for the title, artist, and duration. And you can see how that's made in our playlist view handlebars, where we have our add track and then specifically our list tracks is what we're concerned about here. So that's a bit more complicated. It's put into our handlebars main, and handlebars will create the HTML from the main handlebars, and then in turn the body, which will basically expand our partials out to include our menu, our playlist title, our add tracks partial, and our add track partial, and our list tracks partial. So that's everything today. Is a bit of a repetition of what we would have went through last week, and in the lab, you can start from this repository here, and you can also clone that down. You can start with what you had last week as well. That's no problem at all. And you'll step through adding, the track model, add track, working with different partials to list your tracks, and then some exercises. And I will work through that lab to get rid of any glitch references, because we were intending on using glitch for this module this semester. However, 3 weeks ago, glitch said it's going to be deactivated. So we'll look at a different way of hosting our applications either next week or the week after. So that concludes week 3. So best of luck with the lab. And again, this is a shorter kind of video. So please really do the labs and do them in order to kind of cement this stuff, so that when you get to doing your assignment, it should all be second nature to you. Okay, that's everything for this week. So best of luck.